on a limestone hillside above the Sea of Galilee, where wild mustard grows between the rocks and the wind carries the smell of fish drying on the shore below, a carpenter's son once sat down among fishermen and tax collectors and taught them 11 sentences that would outlast every empire that has ever tried to erase them. And almost no one who recites those 11 sentences today realizes they are standing inside the wreckage and glory of an argument that had been raging for centuries before Jesus ever opened his mouth. An argument about who gets to speak to God and how and in what language and with what right. Because in the first century, the act of prayer was never neutral. It was political. It was tribal. It declared which God you served and which king you feared and which priesthood held the keys to your soul. And into that charged and guarded air, Jesus handed a prayer so short a child could memorize it before sundown, and so dangerous that within a generation it would help unravel the entire architecture of religious gatekeeping in the ancient Near East. Because notice first where he does not put it. He does not deliver it inside the temple in Jerusalem. He does not hand it to the priests who alone were permitted to pronounce the divine name over the sacrifices. He does not whisper it in the inner court, where incense curled toward a curtain no ordinary Israelite was allowed to pass. He speaks it in the open air, on a mountainside with no walls and no gate, and no admission price, to men who smelled of nets and salt water, and who had never been taught Hebrew liturgy beyond what they absorbed sitting in the back rows of the village synagogue. And the very location is a quiet act of rebellion against a system that had spent 400 years teaching ordinary people that access to God required intermediaries, robes, bloodlines, and permission. And to understand exactly how radical that open-air setting truly was, it helps to remember what prayer looked like across the wider world these Galileans actually lived inside. Because Rome had occupied this land for decades by the time Jesus spoke, and Roman religion functioned as an elaborate system of contracts. A citizen offered incense or wine to a household god, or to the divine spirit of the emperor himself in exchange for protection, prosperity, or safe passage. Prayer there was transactional, formulaic, recited word for word from inherited scripts, because the Romans believed that a single mispronounced syllable could void the entire exchange and invite disaster. Temples to these gods stood in nearly every city of the empire, staffed by professional priests who alone knew the correct forms, and ordinary people paid to have prayers performed on their behalf because they themselves were not trusted to get the wording right. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, roughly 100 miles south of this hillside, Israel's own priesthood guarded an even more exclusive threshold. The temple compound was arranged in concentric rings of access, an outer court where any Gentile visitor could walk, then a court restricted to Jewish women, then a further court restricted to Jewish men, then finally an inner sanctuary that only priests from a single hereditary line could enter. And within that sanctuary stood one chamber, curtained off, entered by only one man, the high priest, only once a year, on the single, most solemn day of the Jewish calendar. Everyone else, no matter how devout, prayed at a distance, mediated by priests, by sacrifice, by bloodline. So when Jesus sits down on open ground with no curtain, no incense, no hereditary priesthood standing between the crowd and the words he's about to teach them, he is not merely offering a nice new prayer. He is functionally declaring that the entire architecture of religious access built up over centuries no longer determines who gets to speak to the Father. Picture the scene as it likely unfolded. Terraced hillsides the color of dry wheat, scattered basalt boulders left over from ancient volcanic flows, a scatter of fishing boats pulled up on a beach far below where the water catches the light like hammered silver, and a crowd sitting not on benches but directly on the ground, dust on their sandals, some of them still holding coils of rope or baskets they had been carrying when they stopped to listen. And among them, this new teacher, unlike the rabbis who taught by citing chains of earlier rabbis, is remembered by everyone present precisely because he taught as one who needed no one else's authority to borrow, and the prayer he gives them that day is not lifted wholesale from any single existing source. It is something closer to a distillation, the way a vintner reduces an entire vineyard down into a single cup, because every phrase in it has deep roots reaching back into the soil of Israel's older prayers, while somehow tasting entirely new. Consider the ancient world these fishermen actually inhabited. A world of Roman tax farmers who could seize a man's boat, his house, even his children as collateral for debt. A world where a bad harvest season could turn a free landowner into a bonded servant within a single winter. A world where the average day laborer earned perhaps 1 denarius, barely enough to feed a family that same day, with nothing left over to store against tomorrow. This is the audience receiving a line about daily bread, and it would have landed on them not as poetry, but as an economic reality. They lived inside every single morning, wondering whether there would be flour enough to bake, whether the well would still be running, whether the tax collector would arrive before the harvest was in. When Jesus tells them to ask for bread only for this day, and not for a granary of surplus, he is not offering a spiritual metaphor floating above their circumstances. He is speaking directly into the anxious arithmetic of subsistence farming under imperial taxation. And there is an older story sitting behind this line that the Galilean crowd would have known instinctively, even if a modern reader misses it entirely. Centuries earlier, their ancestors had wandered a wilderness south of this very region after fleeing slavery in Egypt. And in that wilderness, when their stored food ran out and panic set in, a strange substance appeared on the ground each morning. Thin flakes like frost, which they gathered and ground and baked, and the rule attached to that provision was severe and specific. Gather only enough for today, because anyone who tried to hoard it overnight found it had bred worms and rotted by morning, except on the day before the Sabbath, when a double portion was permitted to last through the day of rest. That ancient bread taught an entire generation of former slaves that provision comes from trust, renewed daily, rather than wealth, stockpiled against fear. And when Jesus teaches this new generation to ask for their bread 1 day at a time, he is quietly reopening that same wilderness lesson, reminding a crowd whose grandparents told wilderness stories around their fires that the God who fed their ancestors flake by flake in the desert has not stopped being that same God. Picture it in your mind. Thin white flakes gathered by torchlight before the desert heat could melt them. Baskets carried back to tents pitched between red sandstone cliffs. And centuries later, the same trust distilled into 6 words spoken on a green hillside instead of a barren wilderness. Now consider the opening address itself, because before any request is made, before bread or forgiveness or protection is mentioned, the prayer establishes a relationship, and the word chosen for that relationship was not the most obvious one available. Ancient prayers addressed to deities across the Mediterranean world typically opened with formal titles: Sovereign, Master, Lord of Hosts, King of the Universe, and Israel's own liturgical prayers, the ones recited in synagogues on Sabbath mornings, followed that same convention: formal, reverent, appropriately distant, the kind of address you would use for an emperor you had never met and never expected to meet. But this prayer opens with a term of household intimacy, the word a small child uses for a parent who has just walked through the door after a day of work. A word spoken across kitchen tables and courtyards, not throne rooms, and the crowd sitting on that hillside would have felt the strangeness of it immediately, because no one addressed the God of Israel that way in public liturgy. It would have sounded almost too familiar, almost presumptuous. And yet, Jesus places that word first, before glory, before power, before any acknowledgement of divine majesty, establishing that the very first posture of prayer is not fear, but belonging. And then, in the same breath, he adds a description that stretches that same intimate father figure across the entire architecture of the cosmos, dwelling not in one place, but filling every layer of reality above the visible sky. And these two ideas, a father you could run to as a child runs to a parent, and a being who inhabits every dimension of creation at once, are deliberately placed side by side without resolution. The prayer does not soften one to fit the other. It holds both simultaneously and asks the one praying to hold them to closeness without smallness, majesty without distance. Imagine it visually as a single figure standing with one hand extended toward a village of small stone houses and olive presses, and the other hand disappearing into a canopy of stars, stretching beyond any horizon a human eye could measure. That tension is the doorway into everything that follows. The prayer then turns to two requests about God Himself before it ever mentions human need. First, that His name be honored the way it deserves to be honored, and second, that His reign arrive and take hold. And both of these requests carry an unspoken confession buried inside them. If a God's name were already universally honored, there would be nothing left to ask for. And if His reign had already fully arrived, there would be no reason to plead for its coming. So embedded inside the opening lines of the most repeated prayer in human history is an admission that the world, as it currently stands, does not yet reflect the God being addressed. This is not comfortable, and it is not meant to be comfortable. It is an honest diagnosis spoken before any personal petition is allowed to follow, only after acknowledging that the world's true king has not yet been given his due. Does the prayer permit the one praying to bring their own hunger, their own guilt, their own fear to the table? And there is a reason this order matters so much to Jesus, that He places it first, because the prayers of the ancient world, whether offered to Baal on the high places, to Caesar as a living god in Roman temples, or even sometimes inside Israel's own synagogues by people going through motions without meaning, tended to begin and end with the petitioner's own needs. Give me rain. Give me victory. Give me healing. And Jesus reverses the entire order, teaching an audience of subsistence fishermen and farmers, people with genuine and pressing needs, to spend the opening of their prayer entirely on someone else's glory before they ever mention their own hunger. And only a teacher utterly confident that this same God already knows every need before it is spoken could afford to structure a prayer this way. Now walk further into the request for provision itself, because the phrase asking for bread this day carries a Greek construction so unusual that ancient translators themselves argued over its precise shade of meaning. Some read it as bread sufficient for existence itself, others as bread for the day that is coming. Tomorrow's portion requested one day in advance, and while later centuries would spill enormous amounts of ink debating which shade is correct, the crowd on the hillside likely heard something simpler underneath the grammar. An assurance that the God being addressed cares about ordinary hunger, that spiritual devotion was never meant to float disconnected above physical need. In the same sermon, Jesus will soon tell this crowd not to worry about what they will eat or wear, pointing them toward birds who neither store grain in barns, nor plant fields, yet are fed regardless, and toward wildflowers on that same hillside, purple anemones and red poppies scattered through the grass each spring, clothed more beautifully than any king's robes, despite doing no labor to earn their color. The prayer for daily bread and that later teaching about birds and flowers are two expressions of a single conviction, that dependence itself, rather than accumulation, is the posture God intends for His children. Then the prayer turns toward debt, and here the original language is startlingly blunt, not the softer language of moral failure or spiritual shortcoming, but the harder language of financial obligation, unpaid accounts, ledgers left open. And this choice of language was not accidental in an economy where debt was not an abstraction, but a daily terror. In villages across Galilee, a man who could not repay a loan might lose his field, then his house, then eventually be forced to sell his own labor, or even his children into servitude until the debt was worked off. The prophet Nehemiah, centuries earlier, had confronted wealthy landowners in Jerusalem for exactly this practice. Families forced to mortgage their fields and vineyards just to buy grain during famine, children sold into bondage while their parents watched helplessly, and the ancient law of Israel had once included a built-in remedy for this cycle. Every 50th year, a jubilee when debts were canceled, land returned to its original families, and bonded servants set free. A periodic reset meant to prevent any single generation from being permanently crushed under inherited poverty. By the time of Jesus, that Jubilee law had largely fallen into disuse, swallowed by centuries of political upheaval, foreign occupation, and shifting economic systems. So when this prayer asks God to cancel debt the way the one praying cancels debt owed to them, it is quietly resurrecting that old Jubilee spirit and relocating it from a national economic policy into the daily posture of an individual heart. And Jesus will return to this exact theme later in his teaching with a story about a servant forgiven an impossibly large debt by his king, a debt so vast it could never realistically be repaid in several lifetimes, who then turns around and seizes a fellow servant by the throat over a comparatively tiny sum, imprisoning him despite his desperate pleading. And when the king discovers this cruelty, he reverses the mercy he had shown. The parable exists as a kind of long-form commentary on this single line of the prayer, illustrating with visceral clarity what happens when a person accepts an enormous forgiveness while refusing to extend even a small one. Picture the imagery of that story directly: ornate courtroom scales and heavy coin bags representing a debt beyond counting, set against a single small handful of coins clutched by a desperate debtor being dragged by the collar. The contrast is the entire point. Then the prayer turns to protection, asking not to be led into testing and to be delivered from evil. And this line sits closer to the raw experience of the very desert that shaped Israel's imagination than most readers realize. That same wilderness south of Galilee where manna once fell was also the place where the nation, freed from slavery, repeatedly failed its own trials, grumbling at bitter water, worshipping a golden calf, while their deliverer was still on the mountain receiving instructions. And it is that same wilderness, or one very much like it: barren limestone hills, dry riverbeds, caves carved into cliff faces by wind and centuries, where Jesus himself had recently spent 40 days facing his own trial before ever climbing this hillside to teach, tested not with pleasant temptations, but with hunger sharpened to its breaking point. Offered shortcuts to power and provision that bypassed dependence on his Father entirely, and having walked through that testing himself, he now teaches an audience of ordinary people, none of whom possess his particular strength, to ask honestly not to be led into trials that would break them. This is not a prayer of confident heroism, it is a prayer of humble self-knowledge, an admission that human faith has limits, and that the same God who permits testing is also the one being asked to measure it with mercy. And there is a final piece of this prayer that most people reciting it today have never traced back to its likely origin. The familiar closing words about the kingdom and the power and the glory belonging to God forever. Words so woven into how the prayer is spoken aloud in churches around the world that many assume they were part of the original teaching from the very beginning. Yet the oldest surviving manuscript copies of this gospel, preserved in ancient monasteries and rediscovered by scholars centuries later, do not contain that closing line at all. It appears to have entered the text later, drawn almost certainly from the final recorded prayer of Israel's ancient King David, spoken publicly near the end of his life, while dedicating resources for a temple he would never live to see built. A prayer that likewise credits God with all greatness, power, and glory. And rather than treating this borrowed ending as some kind of scandal or corruption, it is worth pausing on what it actually reveals, that within a generation or two of Jesus first speaking these words on a hillside, communities of his followers were already so soaked in this prayer, praying it so constantly in gatherings across scattered towns and cities, that they instinctively reached for the language of their own ancestral king to give it a fitting close. The prayer had become communal property almost immediately, passed hand to hand, mouth to mouth, absorbing echoes of Israel's older worship, the way a river absorbs the soil of every bank it passes. Within a few centuries, this same short prayer would be copied onto papyrus scraps in Egyptian monasteries, carved into the plaster walls of churches from Syria to Spain, and eventually inscribed today in more than 140 languages on ceramic tile panels lining the courtyard of a church built on the traditional site of this teaching. A modern pilgrim can walk that courtyard and see the same 11 sentences rendered in Amharic beside Korean, beside Icelandic, beside Swahili, tile after tile after tile, circling the same hillside where fishermen once sat in the dust. And standing in that courtyard today it becomes almost physically obvious what this prayer actually accomplished. A teaching given without walls, without gatekeepers, without a temple admission fee, has ended up belonging to more languages and more nations than any single empire that has ever tried to claim ownership over sacred speech. It is also worth walking briefly through what the disciples sitting closest to Jesus that day actually carried in their own memory when they heard this prayer for the first time, because several of them were not strangers to organized religious life. Some had likely spent time among stricter movements gathered near the Dead Sea, communities that had withdrawn into the wilderness entirely, convinced that the temple leadership in Jerusalem had become corrupt beyond redemption. These desert communities copied scripture by hand in caves overlooking the salt water below, followed rigid daily prayer schedules timed to the rising and setting sun, and believed that true holiness required almost total separation from ordinary village life. Their prayers were beautiful but exhausting, layered with ritual purity requirements that placed the burden of access squarely on the shoulders of the one praying. And against that backdrop, a prayer that could be spoken standing in a fishing boat, kneeling in a courtyard, or whispered while grinding grain at a millstone represented an entirely different vision of what a life devoted to God could look like. Not withdrawal into isolated purity, but engagement with ordinary daily labor, carried alongside constant, simple, repeated dependence. And it is worth noting too that the very fishermen receiving this teaching were themselves familiar with debt. In the most literal sense, first-century Galilean fishing was heavily taxed and often controlled through licensing arrangements with wealthy leaseholders. A poor catch could mean a fisherman owed more in fees than his nets had earned him that week. So when this prayer speaks of debts and debtors, it was not landing on abstract theological ears. It was landing on men who had likely stood on a dock arguing with a tax collector about exactly this problem within recent memory. Now consider the overall shape of what was handed to those fishermen that day, structured not as a random list of requests, but as a deliberate journey, beginning with God's own honor and reign, moving through a hinge that asks heaven's order to take root on earth, and only then descending into the daily and personal. Bread, forgiveness, protection, a movement from the eternal to the immediate. From the vast canopy of stars to a single loaf on a single table. And every later request depends on the foundation laid at the start. A person cannot honestly ask for bread while ignoring the kingdom that bread is meant to serve, cannot honestly ask to be forgiven while withholding forgiveness from someone else, cannot honestly ask for protection from testing while treating God as a distant resource rather than an intimate father. The entire prayer is a single, unbroken current running downward from glory into daily need and back upward again every time it is spoken. And perhaps that is the real reason it has survived every attempt to bury it under either careless repetition or academic dissection, because it was never designed merely to be recited. It was designed to be lived inside, a compass a person carries into every ordinary Tuesday, into every kitchen where bread is baked, into every relationship strained by an unpaid debt of love or money, into every private wilderness where testing feels heavier than it should. 11 sentences spoken first to fishermen on a hillside above a lake that still catches the evening light the same way it did 2,000 years ago, still asking to be received rather than merely repeated, still opening towards something wider than anyone who has ever prayed it has fully understood. And perhaps the clearest way to hold all of this together is to picture the prayer not as a wall built once and finished, but as a well dug into old ground, something a person returns to again and again over a lifetime, drawing up water that never runs dry, no matter how many mornings the same bucket is lowered. A fisherman on that hillside could not have known that his 11 sentences would one day be spoken, in courtrooms and hospital rooms, in refugee camps and coronation ceremonies, by monks rising before dawn, and by children taught to fold their hands before sleep. He only knew that a teacher he trusted had handed him a way of speaking to God that did not require a temple he could not enter, a priesthood he did not belong to, or a fee he could not afford. Only honesty, only daily need, only the willingness to say Father and mean it, and that, more than any argument about grammar or manuscript history, may be the truest reason this short prayer has outlived every empire that has ever tried to stand in its way.